Ian's an amazing, many-sided scholar who works on a variety of topics. He started out from interests in papyrology and early Greek poetry. He wrote a splendid study of Pindar's paeans and has co-edited a number of volumes on Greek lyric and published a lot of articles on it. He's also interested in anthropology and ancient religion, both of Greece, ancient Greece, Anatolia, and Egypt. And he also works on connections between Greece and Egypt and Greece and Anatolia. He's recently published a book on Hittite texts and Greek religion. And he's currently working on graffiti left by visitors at Egyptian temples. And today he's going to give a paper on Theogonies and Theomachies in Egypt, in Greece and elsewhere. So let's welcome him. I'm now going to yes. So here's the PowerPoint. Ian, you should be able to move around in it. I hope.
How can I do that? How do I do that? Okay.
Or else if you have to, just try using the arrow keys if you can.
Doesn't work.
Okay, well then I need to move forward. So just let me know when the next slide comes, all right?
I'll say forward slave and you can just move.
That's great. Okay, thank you. So Ian.
Hi, it's not, I hope you can all hear me. If anyone, does it look like everyone can hear me? Good. Well, I hate Zoom talks and I thought we were done with them. This is going to be fun. Now, I should say that the whole spirit of this talk is slightly, I mean, to be entertaining rather, right? This is some subjects that have interested me over the years. So I'm sort of throwing this up for your interest. I wanted to start with what I'm going to talk about is these myths of origin, cosmological interactions, and the second part will be on one particular text, and we'll come to that. We'll come to that later. So I wanted to start with Greece and the Hittites, and so a bit before Homer, actually, outside the realm of the seminar. So this is about the kingship of heaven theme, which I've worked on quite a bit over the years. Very much interests me, and I'm wondering what Egypt has to do with that. Now, Greek myths of origin. Move forward, slave, again. Thank you. Forward, Peter. Is there are sort of various topics that are dealt with in this sort of area. We have origins of the cosmos. For example, the separation of earth and sky. We have generations of gods, divine succession. We have gods and monsters, and we have the golden age and the early myth history of mankind. Those are dealt with by Hesiod in the Theogony. That's just happens to be the canonical text we have, but there must have been. We know there are other poems that deal with these things, some of the themes are also dealt with in his works and days. I'm not going to go into detail on these texts. I assume people know something about them because even Egyptologists usually know a bit about early Greece. There's another Greek Theogony, which is quite important, the so-called Orphic Theogony, which covers some of these themes as well. And that's different because it involves a cosmic egg, which fathers a creature called Phanes, and then eventually Zeus is born and he swallows all the other gods. So there's a different sort of thing, but it's still a Greek one. So move forward. So there are correlates for this in the ancient Near East. Now, as I said, I've worked on this sort of stuff quite a bit, so I'm possibly assuming, I've had to be careful about assuming knowledge in people, because to some of you, this stuff may be completely baffling. But we have the most important one, the one people know best, is the so-called kingship in heaven cycle, which is Hittite, Hurrian, and possibly originally Syrian. The most important of those is the poem that used to be called the Song of Kumarbi, the Song of Emergence. This is about how Kumarbi deposes the sky god. He bites his genitals, and therefore becomes the mother of the storm god, who's the next generation. It's like something out of Alien. And then we have we have also poems about divine conflict, Ulikumi, and so on. We have Babylonian poems. The most important of those is probably the Atrahasis poem, which deals with the creation of man and the flood. very important poem, which wasn't published until the late 60s. And also a cycle of poems from, or narratives from Ugarit, the Baal cycle, which deals with gods and monsters, and finally a Phoenician version of divine succession, which the Phoenicians had these things too, and that's preserved by Philo. So if you compare those to Hesiod, you get similarities and also differences. Not exactly the same, but it looks kind of connected. It's usually impossible to prove exact borrowings, but people kind of they hedge on it and they say, well, that probably some sort of common tradition. It looks too connected to be random. So we think of a common tradition, a koine, which shared approaches to issues like divine succession and divine time in the northeast Mediterranean. So the question is, how does Egypt stand in relation to this? To get to Egypt at last. And I quote here a paper by the esteemed Carolina Lopez Ruiz, who's a really brilliant scholar working on these themes. And she says in an OCD article, Oxford Classical Dictionary from 2012, she says, Egyptian influence in cosmogony, on the other hand, is less evident, but not totally absent. And she cites my article, which makes me laugh because it's not very good, Mythology of the Black Land, Greek Myths and Egyptian Origins, which is a companion to Greek mythology. Please don't look at that because it's written a long time ago. So I thought today what I want to do is to try to fill in some of the Egyptian side of this. So let's move to the next slide. Well, sources for Egyptian mythology. I mean, for one thing, these are older than anywhere else, going right back to the 3rd millennium BC. There are fewer longer narratives than there are in Greece and the Hittites, but there are some, like the myth of the heavenly cow, which we'll be talking about later. And there are funerary texts, which contain references, so often kind of obscure, and the astronomical book of Nut, which is important, sacred calendars, local mythological manuals from later period, such as the Brooklyn Mythological Papyrus, which these things, again, they've only been published in the last few decades. So I think this field is kind of changing a little bit. Now, these sources are rich, but they show a lot of variation, and it's not always easy to reconstruct coherent myths from these things. In fact, some people doubt whether there was really myths, longer cycles of myths in Egypt at all at this period. Next slide. Next slide. Now, some people, we do find, I mean, Egypt looks different to the rest of the Mediterranean. And that's what the Greeks said. And you get the feeling the Egyptians are sometimes kind of proud of being different. They sort of foreground that. But actually, there are lots of similarities as well. I mean, obviously, these myths deal with the same sort of themes. We have a creation of gods, different theogonies associated with Heliopolis, Hermopolis, Memphis. The Hermopolis one, which we're going to talk about in particular, explains the origin of the Ennead, 9 gods. That's Atum, who produces, by masturbating, produces Shu and Tefnut, and then they produce Geb and Nut, and then they produce Osiris, Isis, Seth, and so on. And the Hermopolis theogony focuses on the Ogdoad, who are primeval eight gods, mysterious 8 gods, male and female. We also have myths about the separation of earth and sky, which is a universal myth. The Book of Nut deals with that. Have monsters, conflict with monsters, particularly Re and Apophis, the important monster, and that sort of it's conceived as happening all the time. Actually, it's repeated endlessly. Myths are not something necessarily that happened in the distant past. And the other one is Osiris and Horus versus Seth, originally a brother of Osiris, who becomes monsterized, particularly as the centuries go on. The Greeks identify him with Typhon. And then we have also the Golden Age and mankind. Another theme. The myth of the heavenly cow is very important here. So once Re ruled, but he became tired and men rebelled. Hathor is then sent out, the sun's eye, to destroy many of them with fire. And she was so successful that Re wanted her to calm down, and so he had her drink dyed beer dyed red, which resembled a flood of blood. Ludwig Kernen, who's I'd like to mention as a classical scholar who contributed an enormous amount to this subject of Egyptian relations to Greece. He never did a book on it, but his work's really very important. And he suggested in a 1994 paper that this myth is kind of analogous to Hesiod's myth of the Golden Age and to the Babylonian Atrahasis. So it has earlier and later eras. The later period is obviously the present period, and the earlier period is kind of a period where gods and men maybe lived in harmony together, like a golden age. One particular element of that, which is interesting, is that there's a flood of beer in the Heavenly Cow, and it's almost as if that's been inserted because it kind of corresponds to the flood in Atrahasis, the normal flood, except it has a different function. And I quote something there by Kernen, which I think puts it very well. I can't actually read that entirely because it's blocked by the list of participants. I'm not sure whether I can remove that. But this tale gives voice to concepts drawn from Egyptian myth, rituals, and the geographical conditions of the Nile Valley. This is Kernen talking about the myth of the Heavenly Cow. Nevertheless, there are also elements shared with Hesiod. And he actually thinks there may have been borrowing there. He thinks this could have been borrowed in the Bronze Age. So Egypt could actually be the source indirectly, along with Babylonia, for some of the Greek myths. You may think that's a sort of rather old-fashioned view, but it might be right in some way. I think, as Egypt is established so early. So let's move to the next one. So there's that was the quote. I wrote it out for myself. Okay, next one. So there's a tendency sometimes to think of Egypt as isolated from the rest of the Mediterranean, but of course, in some ways it's very connected. And a very good example of that from the mythical point of view is Astarte and the Insatiable Sea, this very important narrative text, apparently from the New Kingdom. People argue about the exact date. And this is quite clearly, I say apparently, but it's quite clearly modeled on the early Syrian myth of the storm god's combat with the sea. But it's been integrated into an Egyptian religious framework. For example, Astarte is a member of the Ennead. Now, this is a very un-Egyptian myth, since the sea plays such a small part in Egyptian mentality. And it's also a fascinating text because you can see it's been sort of partially integrated into the Egyptian theology. The Egyptian Seth equals Baal, a form of the Syrian storm god. It's a Syrian version of the storm god. There's a god, but he's written as Seth in this text. There's also a goddess Renenuset, who seems to correspond to a Syrian god Dagon. I reference a very nice article by Noya Ayala-Darshan in this on this subject. But some gods' names are left in their Semitic form. So we have Astarte herself, and also Yam, which is the Semitic for sea, but it turns up just as a name in this text. I guess the Egyptians don't really have a sea god to replace it with. And the context for this happening could well be the occupation of North Egypt by the Hyksos, probably. I mean, there's so much Syrian Amorite influence at that time. Okay, next slide. Equally, it's possible that the Egyptians exported myths, and that's been suggested too. This is, I just mentioned this here, it's again Ayala-Darshan from 2017. She argued that the Ugaritic narrative of Baal and Mot, which is late Bronze Age, and Mot is god of death. And she actually suggested this could be influenced by Egyptian ideas about the conflict between Seth and Osiris. There's an image there of an Egyptian making an offering to a god which has been found in Ugarit, actually. So that shows you how much contact there was. Okay. Yes. Okay. Next slide. We'll come back to all of this later. Now, the only real hard evidence for Egyptian cosmogonic or theogonic myths coming into Greek sources is very late. And this is creation stories which turn up in the magical papyri and in other similar texts. So I just give one example there. There are several examples, but actually I've given a couple of examples. Saunaron showed that the laughing cosmogony, so a god laughs and it gives birth to something. And this turns up in the magical papyri, and he suggests that this recalls a cosmogony from Esna in the Roman period. I think that must be right. The only qualification there is that you wonder whether some of these things go in both directions, but most likely it's Egypt to Greece. Another story about mankind having its origins in the tears of the gods, and that turns up in Proclus, attributed to Orphic belief. And Mark Smith has allowed, I mean, he's generally very skeptical about influence, Mark Smith, but he thinks that the magical papyri show influence. And there's one particular cosmogony involving an egg and the winds, which he thinks is imitated there. Okay, next slide. Greeks kind of, in the Hellenistic period and even the classical period, Greeks knew something about Egyptian cosmogonies. Diodorus, who's Roman period, but drawing on Hecataeus in about 300 BC, explicitly says that the Greeks took their theogony from Egypt. He says, Olympus also, they say, brought from Egypt the rites which the Greeks celebrated in the name of Dionysus, the myths about Kronos, and the war with the Titans, and in a word, the account of the things which happened to the gods. Now that's, I'm not saying this is no doubt invented, but it's interesting that he says it nevertheless. Herodotus already says something similar, but Diodorus has added the bit about the myths about Kronos and the war with the Titans. Herodotus thought that most Greek religion actually came from Egypt, including the Orphic bit. And he'd also heard about Theogonies. He says that the Egyptian gods had 3 generations. The 8, which is, he says, is pre-17,000 BC, the 12, 17,000 BC, and the 3rd generation, 15,000 BC, all correlated with different gods. Some people think Herodotus makes a lot of this stuff up, but I think a lot of it must be based on something. And the 8 clearly corresponds to the Ogdoad. Even the 12 could be modeled on the Ennead. You might say that's ridiculous, but the Ennead actually was sometimes expanded. So it could have been 12. There's a good article by Gwyn Griffiths on that. And even if it's not true, I mean, it's the sort of thing that Egyptians were certainly saying at the time. Move on. Scholars have sometimes tried to find parallels for motifs in Greek theogonies in Egypt, and that's almost too easy to play, because Egyptian religious texts are full of counterintuitive stories about the gods. Anything that's kind of slightly weird, you're bound to come up with the same things. How many ways in which can an anthropomorphic god produce something else? God has to come out of some part of the body, or the seed has to come out of some part of the body. So I'll give a couple of examples. Hesiod's castration of Uranos. A scholar called Meltzer cited a self-castration of Re in the Book of the Dead, cited there. Re or Ra gives birth to Hu and Sia. Well, not much for parallel, but it's interesting. The myth of Horus and Seth has a strange scene that could almost be a parody of some divine passing on of seed, where Seth gives Horus's seed and then Horus gives it back, and Seth burns. Another theme is gods eating their children. It's Kronos. It's also an Orphic theme. This can be parallel in the Book of Nut, where Nut eats her children and Geb complains. We'll come back to that later. Being pointed out by Peter Walcott in a book. And the same idea is found in one of the Hemorrhology, a book of lucky and unlucky days. Re swallows all the gods, kills them, vomits them out back as birds and fishes. That's strangely parallel to something which happens in the Orphic Theogony, actually, but could just be random. Next slide. Another parallel that's been claimed, which is kind of fun, is has to do with the goddess Metis, the Titaness, mother of Athene, who was swallowed by Zeus, and her no, of course, her name means intelligence, cunning intelligence is what people normally say. Chris Ferroni and Emily Tita compared this with the Egyptian goddess Mot, justice. Of course, Metis is originally Martis in Greek, and I think it is. I can't remember. I hope it is. And Pharaoh. That sounds kind of random, but pharaohs are depicted offering Mot to the gods, almost as if it's food. So eat this. That's a picture of one. So it's interesting. I don't know how likely that is, but it's a nice idea. Another thing that's been played with is the idea that Hesiod's Pandora has a parallel, the creation of Pandora by Athene and Hephaestus, and it's been suggested this has a parallel in, you can't really see it there, but that's as good as I could do from the original picture. That's believe it or not, it's Hatshepsut, Queen Hatshepsut, who is at Deir al-Bahari, is depicted. That's her sort of conception, her creation by two deities. You can just see them in the middle. It's so random. It's almost worthless, but these things are bound to happen. Next slide. Another area is the Orphic egg. Orphism. The Greeks were always saying that Orphism is connected with Egypt. So Orphic religion, if you don't know, is a branch of Greek religion, sometimes associated with Dionysus of the afterlife. The poems are supposed to have been composed by Orpheus, who's a sort of mythological seer and singer, and maybe it was influenced by Egypt. I mean, Walter Burkert, one of the greatest scholars of Greek religion, sort of put his money on this in 2004. He thought it might have happened in the 6th century BC. Some people think it didn't happen until a bit later. Could be, actually. I mean, the problem there, to digress, the problem is that you think of esoteric Greek ways of dealing with the dead, and we have these things like gold lamellae or the Eleusinian mysteries. And of course, the big problem is that Egyptian treatment of the dead is so different from anywhere else. Nobody else mummifies the dead in the same way they do. So you would have thought of it, if there was borrowing, it would have been different. But maybe there was some other form of, maybe it was borrowed for some other reason. Anyway, Aristophanes, birds, 692 following, in the 5th century BC, has this passage which talks about everything coming from a wind egg, which is unusual in Greek thought. Certainly this early, eggs are common in the origin myths in all cultures, but they are typically Egyptian. Siegfried Moritz in 1954 argued that this combination of egg and wind is characteristically Egyptian, and it exploits a paranomasia in Greek between the two words. Martin West in 1997 seems to agree, though he thinks the idea was mediated via Phoenicia. There are problems with this, however. The only early Greek sources are comic poets, so it might be joking. The birds are speaking, so of course they're going to talk about eggs. And the other problem is that this is wind egg here is in Greek hoper nemion oon, which really normally means an egg produced without a male, so it's empty, not so much an egg produced by the winds. So I think we have to be very cautious about that, but it could be right. Next slide. So the problem here is proving interaction, proving borrowing. And as I say, the problem is the same minimally counterintuitive ideas are bound to recur. Things about the strange way gods reproduce. Minimally counterintuitive is a concept from cognitive theory of cognitive science of religion, as you may know. You need something more specific than just a vague resemblance, like a name, as in Astarte and the sea, or it needs to be something that looks really unusual, like divine laughter. Or it needs to really look odd in its context, out of place. That's a bit difficult because anything like this is bound to look out of place. But nevertheless, you know, like the sea in Egypt is a bit out of place. And we also need a story about how influence or borrowing might come about. And we also need to decide what level of certainty we're aiming for. You know, probabilities and possibilities are also interesting, because they may build up into a stronger case. And finally, it's useful to triangulate and compare with other cultures. You see this India, China, Mayans, etc. I mean, in a sense, we're not much further on than Victorians were in working in this sort of stuff, because there still isn't a kind of a complete encyclopedia of all things. These things you can look at, but that's a problem for another generation. Okay, move on. So I went to the second part of this is one particular text that I thought was interesting, and that is the text called which I call the Irish succession narrative. So next slide. To introduce this, if you compare, I mentioned the Heliopolitan Theogony, which basically goes, that's the Ennead. It basically goes Atum and Atum Re, and then you have Shu and you have Shu and Tefnut, and then first generation after him. Then you have Geb and Nut, and then you have the generation of Osiris. Now, one that looks vaguely similar to, say, Hesiod, because you've got generations. Except when, where do you not have generations? You're bound to have them. But and 3 is a good number. It's quite easy to remember. If you had more, you might get confused. But one difference between the Egyptian one is that and the Hesiod one is the transitions don't seem violent or messy. No one castrates anyone. I mean, Greek religion is full of, Egyptian religion is full of violence, strange violence. But in this particular narrative, Shu doesn't castrate Re, Geb doesn't castrate Shu, or so on. It all seems quite peaceful and like they're one happy family, and the older gods survive to be part of the pantheon. This was actually argued by a woman called Susan Hollis, Otiose deities in the ancient Egyptian pantheon, which I found quite helpful. But that distinction isn't as clear as all that. For one thing, in Hesiod, in the Greek tradition and the Ugaritic tradition, the older gods survive as well. Kronos, he lives, and so does El in the Ugaritic one. And there's another view, which is that of Jan Assmann, Theological Responses to Almana, and he says on the complete contrary, every passage of rulership is marked by a severe crisis. So crisis one, crisis one is the first transition. So Re to in this case it's Re to Geb, and that corresponds to the separation of gods and men and earth and sky. The last crisis from Geb to Osiris and so on is of course marked by the famous Horus and Osiris, Seth and Horus drama, which involves every form of aberrant behavior. But also, Assmann thinks that the crisis between Shu and Geb he thinks that transition has a crisis too, and that's described in an obscure text found in Arish, in the extreme, in the North Sinai, near the coast, to which I will turn now. So next slide. So this is the Arish succession myth, or succession narrative. And this is a bit complicated. And I have to stress that my knowledge of Egyptology is, limited. I'm a classicist by profession, so I may well make errors here, but I like to try and expand my horizons. There were 4 naoi, as they're called, small shrines, were put up by Nectanebo I in the early 4th century at Per Sopdu, Saft el Henna in the Delta. If you go to the next one, you can see that Peter, can you move forward? You can see Saft el Hena there, and Arish there, El Arish, is in the Sinai. Okay, move back. Now, 3 of these were dedicated to Shu, Tefnut, and Sopdu. The dedicatee of the 4th could be Geb, and that's the one we're most concerned with. The Shu Naos, which is often called the Naos of the decades or decades, amazing object actually. It's got one of the most extraordinary histories of any archaeological artifact. It was found, these things for some reason were taken away from Per Sopdu. This one was in the north west of Egypt, and part of it was found underwater, I think in the 1930s. So it's kind of been all put back together. But the Shu Naos describes how Shu succeeded Re. And that Naos is mostly, the content mostly has to do with astronomy, actually, with celestial events. It catalogues the decades, celestial decades, 36 decades. The Geb Naos has a mythological narrative. It's first published in 1890, Goyon, German translation by Sternberg Al-Hatabi, 95, and it's one of the most difficult texts I could imagine working on, because the Egyptian doesn't always make sense. It needs to be faulty and it has to be amended at points. So there are 3 sides. The first one is all about Shu, who's succeeded Re, Atum Re, and he comes from Memphis to Per Sopdu and builds a festival hall. He sort of claims it, and he's attacked by Apophis and Apophis' sons. I don't know what himself means. No, I don't know. Didn't proofread. Side 2, sadly, is mostly lost. Probably that's where the most important bit was. And then there's a side 3. We're assuming we're reading these sides in the right order. Side 3 is it's very, very obscure. There's a revolution, somebody takes over, Shu dies for some reason. It uses the phrase "goes to heaven," which occurs in Egyptian normally means, or always means, die. Although in Shu's case, it might actually mean go to heaven, because that's kind of where he is, as we'll see. Then Geb sees and loves Tefnut, his mother. That's what the text says. Geb then tries to kind of succeed, tries to take over the kingdom. He's initially burnt by the Uraeus, or the Uraeus deity, but he eventually figures out how to emulate Shu and become his successor. So it's Jan Assmann who calls that the succession myth. So this could, partly this is political. I mean, Apophis may represent the Persian Empire, which Egypt is, fighting in the at this time. Some people have suggested it could be inspired by Nectanebo-Nepo's usurpation of the throne from Nepherites II, last pharaoh of the 29th dynasty. I mean, Egyptian myths certainly do often have a political function. We can't rule that out. Next slide. Next slide. And I wanted to say the first seminar in this series was on, well, it wasn't the second one actually. Was it the second or first? Was on Isis and Arion, which is this new new text preserved apparently in both Greek and Demotic. Greek edition by Lucia Prascello, who seems to be listening, I'm pleased to say, and Joachim Quark in 2019. Now, this is basically a sort of gods on earth narrative. The gods, the next generation of gods, Isis and so on, Thoth, are trying to defend Osiris, and there are points in contact with the text we've just been looking at. There's an attack by Apophyses in Isis and Arion, plural Apophyses, which may be meant to be sort of giants. And secondly, there's a very interesting scene of a god dying and causing a crisis in nature. That's Osiris in the demotic version of Isis and Ariad, and something similar on a shorter scale happens with Shu in the Arish text. And I sort of wonder whether, you know, this is kind of relevant to the general paper, but I wonder if this is part of a wider cycle of oral and written literature, which sort of runs alongside the official text. So the difference, of course, is that the Arish narrative is written in classical Egyptian, and this one is in Isis and Ariad, it's demotic Egyptian. But you know, they could still be drawing on the same ideas. So next slide. I wanted to say something about the transition now, which I mentioned earlier at the beginning of slide C. Now, again, I have to stress that I did try and figure some of this out, but what Egyptian I have is a bit rusty, so I'm not even going to. If anyone asks about the philology, I will just you know, defer to somebody else. But what seems to happen is that it begins with someone in power. We don't even know whether it's Shu or Geb. Different people think different things. This person celebrates a festival, possibly a Set festival. Then there's a rebellion. It all happens quite fast. Geb is involved. He sees Tefnut and loves her. And then there's sort of chaos because, you know, nature, storms and so on, because Shu is dead. Tefnut comes from Memphis, and Geb grabs her, seizes her by force. Not certain. Different people have different views of what's going on. And then there's another description of a storm lasting 9 days because Shu has died. The funeral of Shu lasts 75 days. That's a traditional figure in Egypt with astronomical significance. Geb doesn't go south to Heliopolis, where he would have been sworn in as king, and there a group are mentioned who are defined as those who eat what's abhorrent, and they seem to be with Geb, which is a bit mysterious. Then Geb is told about the accomplishments of Shu, and then he eventually he touches the Uraeus, as I said, gets burnt, and this is a further crisis. But eventually he's healed, and he becomes king, and then he kind of takes over the kingdom, and there's a catalogue of the places which are within Egypt. Okay, next one. One issue in all of this is the death of Shu. We don't really know why he died. I mean, the text it talks about his death. It says 3 times that Shu went up to heaven. Egyptian gods, you know, they die, but they survive it. And it's a slightly difference in the conception of gods too. I suppose that's kind of common to some other cultures as well. As I said, it's not explained why he dies, and since Geb is not at first legitimate ruler, he has to kind of figure out how to become king. It sounds as if the tradition isn't smooth. It's not clear what goes on. I mean, the obvious possibility is that he was killed by Apophis or his children. I think that's unusual because Apophis is normally associated with Re and with Seth, the good side of Seth, helping him. Another possibility is that he just kind of grew old and tired, which is what happens to Re in the Heavenly Cow. It's a bit odd too. I mean, what he does after that is kind of goes and holds the heavens up. So that's a bit of odd behavior for someone who's old and tired. But I suppose it's not impossible. And then there's also the possibility that Geb helped to kill him. This would, you know, but it's kind of not unparalleled in Egyptian religious mentality. After I wrote that, I realized I couldn't actually think of an example of patricide, but gods kill each other all the time. Horus kills his mother. And the last view has actually been argued by two Egyptologists whose minds seem to be very good, von Leven, 2016, and Quark, 2013. Other people don't think that's right. So let's move on to the next one. And then there's the problem of Geb and Tefnut. it seems to say Griffith originally in 1890 read, then Geb saw Tefnut and loved her greatly. His heart desired her, and then later on he seized her by force. And that kind of makes sense in this context because, of course, marrying the previous queen could be seen as a way of confirming one's legitimacy, as in the Mesopotamian Dunu Theogony. See Lambert's edition of the Babylonian myths. In Egyptological terms, it actually suggests something else, which is the idea of the Karmutev, literally the bull of his mother, which implies one who has intercourse with his own mother. So the idea is extraordinary idea, which is your power is so cosmic that you regenerate by having intercourse with your own mother and sort of reproducing yourself. Extraordinary idea. Alan Lloyd, in his commentary on Herodotus, suggests that there might be something like that might be in the background in Herodotus's, not Herodotus's, account of a festival in Egypt, that of Ares at Praemus, where Ares, there's a big sort of riot, part of a ritual, where because Ares, represented as a statue, wants to visit his mother, and people try and stop him. So this could have a sort of ritual significance. Now, the idea that Geb has sex with his mother has been challenged by some scholars. I list them there. As you see, it's been worked on quite recently. And one recent interpretation worth mentioning is this Withun 2017, and that he suggests that Tefnut could represent the royal Urias here. So that's what Geb is in love with, rather than his mother. The problem with all of that is that there are other mythological texts, including some published in the last few decades, which show that Geb did have sex with Tefnut. So it seems likely that this was mentioned here, or at least alluded to. So see Rod Leven 2016, Kvark 2013, and Matic 2021. One of those texts is the early 26th dynasty Brooklyn papyrus with the number I mentioned, and another is and that's early. That's probably 7th century BC. And another is a demotic magical papyrus, which we can see on the next slide. No, we can't. Ah, damn. Well, that happens. The wrong thing came out. I'm really sorry, but that's the wrong bit of the PDF came out. I didn't check that one. Damn it. The text, I'll just look it up for you. Hang on. I can tell you what it says. 30 seconds. So it's a magical papyrus, PDM 143665, and it says the method of separating a man from a woman and a woman from her husband. Woe, woe, flame. Geb made his form into that of a bull. He had intercourse with his mother Tefnut. Again, as the heart of his father cursed his face, the fury of him whose soul is as a flame, while his body is a pillar, and so on. So the historiola of this spell, which is how to separate a man from a woman, or vice versa, is to use this curse, which Shu made when Geb had intercourse with Tefnut. So it's clearly a very well known myth. So next one. Geb is sometimes seen as a disruptive figure, and this line's been pushed recently by Alessandra van Leven. She's mentioned this in a couple of publications, and having sex with his mother is part of it. She also mentioned the Book of Nut, where it's Geb who provokes Shu to separate earth and sky, Geb and himself and Nut, by quarreling with Nut. We've seen this passage already on the grounds that she was eating her children. So it's Geb actually, because he's so quarrelsome, Geb actually causes the earth and sky to separate. Sort of interesting to compare that with what happens in Greek myth. There's another suggestion actually that's been made by someone called Jurgensen that in some versions of the myth, the separation of earth and sky could have come about when Shu cursed Geb because of his incest with Tefnut, so the myth I just mentioned. Von Leven also suggests that in one early mytheme, Geb might have had intercourse with his daughter Isis and actually fathered Horus after Osiris died. Next one. So Geb is sometimes identified with Kronos in the Greco-Roman period. In fact, he's always identified with Kronos, as is clear from Plutarch and Diodorus. This probably goes back at least to Manetho and Hecataeus, so 300 BC. In the Thalium, Kronos can also be identified with Sobek, with whom Geb is sometimes associated. Sobek, the crocodile, god normally represented in crocodile form. And occasionally he's the minor deity Petbi or even Anubis, but those are much rarer. So references there. Why was Geb identified? Why was Kronos identified with Geb? Well, presumably because of his position in the Ennead. He's one generation back from the present generation of gods. And it may also be relevant that Kronos too could be seen as disruptive. He castrates his father, swallows his children, a bit like Hittite Kumarbi. And also Kronos is linked to agriculture, the realm of the earth, and Geb is the earth. Next slide. Now, it has been suggested, rather amazingly, that the Arish succession narrative is influenced by Greece. And this was one of the things that got me originally interested in this a while ago. And this comes from two British Egyptologists who pretty well one of them is surely imitating the wording of the other because they say exactly the same thing. So Wilkinson, The Complete Gods and Goddesses of Ancient Egypt, talks about the late tradition that Geb lusted after his own mother upon his father's death, appears to be based on the Greek myth of the usurpation actually I can't, what's the word, usurp? Never mind, the place of Uranos by his son Kronos, whom the Greeks identified directly with Geb. George Hart in the Routledge Dictionary of Egyptian Gods and Goddesses says something really similar. Talks about the contamination with the Greek myth of the usurpation of Uranos by his son Kronos, whom classical writers identify with Geb. Very interesting. So clearly, Geb is Kronos, and Shu is a bit like Uranos, actually. I mean, technically, the sky is Nut, who Geb is married to. But in fact, Shu is the upper air. That's his sort of function in the iconography of this thing. And he, as such, he controls the movement of the stars through the night. You see, the stars are supposed to kind of circulate, and they, in the day, they're actually inside Nut. And then at night, they kind of come out and they come across her beneath her. And Shu is the upper air, so they're actually going through him. Kronos, the parallel isn't quite right because Kronos doesn't have sex with his mother Gaia, but she helps him by giving him a sickle to kill his father. So there's some sort of relationship there. And this isn't absolutely, I mean, it's not impossible that there's a connection here. The presence of Greek troops in Egypt fighting with the Egyptians against the Persians at this period could provide context. And note also that Nectaneba I probably had a Greek wife. This is Kuhlmann, 1981, Ptolemais. Astarte and the sea shows that myths can move. There's no question they can move around. But next slide. But I'm not convinced of this, actually, at all. I mean, I have to say I find it less than convincing. Even though, hang on. Sorry, I lost my place. So I can't really see that we can contribute the Irish succession narrative direct the Greek influence in the 4th century. And I'm not sure why they hold that view. What you can say is that it's vaguely similar to the Greek and Hittite succession myths, except a sort of gods on earth version of them, which is perfectly fine because that myth is often represented in terms of kind of mortal anthropomorphic kings living on earth in all traditions. So what you can say is it's vaguely similar to the Greek and Hittite ones. If it doesn't have castration and fellation, it does at least have some sort of crisis, as Assmann says, whether caused by Apophis or by something else. Geb, like Kronos and Kumarbi, is sort of one generation back and seems to be a disruptive figure. They're all like this. At first sight, it's problematic, as I said, that Kronos and Kumarbi come sort of after the sky god, when Geb is the brother and husband of the sky goddess Nut. But as I said, Shu is a kind of a higher upper deity too. So it kind of works. It's a way of kind of reconfiguring Egyptian mythology, kind of fit these, to fit the foreign ones. All those three, all Kronos, Kumarbi, and Geb are all associated with the earth. So we have a sort of upper lower sequence. You can't rule out some sort of influence from the ancient, from Syria, actually, at some point. We've seen that with Astarte and the sea. So it's different from Hesiod, but it's also comparable. The present divine order is established by a sequence of generations involving upper and lower realms and crises involving evil monsters. And I should say, one thing to bear in mind, a very important point to bear in mind, is it's not like people normally these days often think of the Hesiod and the Hittite traditions as being very, very closely related. But they're not all that close. There are lots of differences between those as well. So one way of talking about this is to say that they're sort of commensurate to some extent. They've been kind of modeled to match each other. You know, how to explain that? Well, one obvious possibility is that myths are not infinitely variable. And Bronze Age monarchies tend to have an interest in succession, and this is reflected in myth. You're bound to have succession myths because that's what's important in life. But it's still kind of, in that case, it's still interesting. We can still kind of compare things, even if they're not connected. But we know myths can travel, so other possibilities arrive. It's just that we have no idea of the how, the when, the where of it. And that depends partly how early the Irish succession narrative is, and we don't know. I think the only reference to that myth is in that text. But you know, given how patchy and incomplete our knowledge of Egyptian mythology must be, it's not impossible it's earlier. So next slide, to go back to the beginning conclusion. Next slide. Well, I think that, maybe I'm exaggerating here, but when people talk about Hittite and Greek theogonic myths as belonging to the same mythological koine, they shouldn't leave Egypt out completely. They deserve to be treated side by side. And the Egyptian tradition is, after all, as old as any of them, and possibly earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that very interesting paper. I'll just stop the slides. I think we've got a few minutes for a few questions if people are interested in or have anything they want to ask Ian, or any comments they want to make on the talk. Yes, I think we have a question from, yeah, so first of all, a comment from Joachim Quack in the chat, who says he's demonstrated some years ago that the tradition of the laughing god goes back to the New Kingdom.
Yeah. Send me his paper.
And we have a question from Julie Lascaris.
Hi, Ian. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed that. And I just have sort of a comment, actually. You had mentioned that when talking about the deaths of gods, Egyptian gods dying and surviving the death, and that is a very different view of the gods from the Greek view. I think I got that right.
Yeah.
I just want to suggest that maybe it's also a very different view of death. You know,
Yes, of course.
the
Yeah.
Egyptians, yeah, with their whole resurrection idea and everything
Yeah.
like that. It might be that as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that whole business of dying and rising gods, of course, is an enormous issue, which I have. I thought about a few years ago, but I've entirely forgotten it. But it's very, very important, of course. Yes, probably is some diffusion. In fact, that's exactly what Ayali Darshan was saying in her paper on the Osiris myth and the Mot myth from Ugarit, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Ian, can you see the chat? Otherwise, I'll read out.
I'm amazed everyone came to this. My God.
Yeah, we have a question.
Oh, that was very hastily put together in case anyone's judging me by that performance.
We have a comment from Bunny Waring, who writes, "Excellent talk as ever, Ian. Good to see you. Apologies for the type question. Why do you think there was such an absence of sea gods in Egypt when freshwater bodies, the Nile being most obvious, were so key to the culture?"
Well, I mean, someone else. That's a huge question. I mean, well, I think Egypt is focused on. You know, they're obsessed with the Nile. I mean, the Nile has its own mythology. I've worked on the Nile myself a little bit. I have a paper which I almost gave today, actually, on how myths about the source of the Nile was religious traditions about how the source of the Nile may have been known in the Greek world, and there's a fragment of Pindar in particular, which I think may amazingly in the 5th century, which I think may have something to do with that. So, but the centers of Egyptian culture are the Memphis or Heliopolis in the north, and then the south, and they're a long way from the sea, actually. So the Egyptians simply don't focus on that very much. It may be that the most, I mean, I'm making this up as I go along, but I imagine the Egyptian ideology is centered on those areas, and they may well have been in the north, in the delta, and areas quite close to the sea. No doubt there were myths relating to the sea, but I can't. Those aren't so well attested. When you get the sense from, I know a little bit about the Bronze Age texts relating to, the Mediterranean, and you get the sense from that the Egyptians see the world, the Mediterranean, as something sort of distant and strange, when they call it the Great Green, and it's where sea peoples come who aren't come to raid and so on. So I just think it's kind of outside their penumbra. Whereas it's very important in Syria, and it's the Greeks, of course, are basically sea peoples as well. So I don't know. But monsters in the Nile, I mean, we can, I don't know. Hippopotamuses and crocodiles are part of, are connected with Egyptian various deities can take the form of those gods, so they are actually quite important. Yes, but I'm not really answering the question very well. But I think that's how I would, that's Astarte and Yam is terrifically important text. It's absolutely extraordinary, without much more important than anybody thinks. Because it's at once, no one can deny that it's possible for foreign narratives to influence Egypt. It gives you permission to look for these things elsewhere. Mm. Yes, Joachim Krakis. Yes, yeah. Well, you're right. I mean, I didn't want to. Chris Faroni is a friend of mine. I can say what I like now because I happen to know that Chris Faroni is at this very moment chairing a seminar on Isidorus, somewhere in Chicago, which I'm supposed to be attending myself, so I know he's not listening to this. But that's right. I think that's I wasn't convinced by that when I first read it, and I'm still not. But you know, strange things happen. It's not impossible, and I think we shouldn't rule out. I mean, we don't want to be put off looking for these connections. You see what I mean? I think we should be open-minded, even though, you know, you'll end up like Martin Bernal, tracing everything. Martin Bernal's awful philology, tracing half of Greek vocabulary to Egyptian. None of it works at all, though. Some of it not that much worse than what Indo-European philology does, actually. So you can get really cranky if you do this. You know, like I mean, there are people who I saw, for example, Joachim will know about this, but when I was doing research, if you Google, you know, Rish Naos, you'll find it's been used by Velikovsky in some theory about, you know, cosmic events in the Bronze Age, probably aliens in there too. So it's you have to be very careful about these things. But generally, I would be very open to people making as many connections as possible, and then we can kind of select which ones are right and which ones are wrong.
I think we have a comment from Alexander von Leven.
Hi, great to see you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, I thank you. I've been using. I want to say I knew Joachim's work already, but I hadn't used yours as much until I started working on this paper. And your stuff's amazing. I cannot imagine how you do that stuff. Alexander works on these astronomical texts, which are amazingly difficult. The maths alone is, anyway, go on. I find it very impressive. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot. What I was thinking was that the reason why Geb becomes identified with Kronos, there is some, at least, good reason to suspect that he was actually punished for violating his mother by being castrated. And
I saw that, yes.
I'm just at the moment working on a project on non-transgressive deities in Egypt. So this will be in a larger framework, what I already did a little bit in this paper in 2016. And when I thought about these things, I thought this is very likely the reason why he was identified with Kronos in Interpretatio Graeca. So that was the comment I wanted to make.
Yes, it's so complicated. I couldn't really have talked about that because the texts are so difficult, and you have to kind of read between the lines in them, don't you? So it's very, very interesting.
Absolutely, yes.
So Geb is castrated.
I think so, yes. There are some very strong hints to that, especially in the Delta Papyrus, the one with the very long number, you know, from Brooklyn.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So we could have, you know, motifs. It could be the motifs are just random. It could be they are connected, but they're being used in different ways. So castration fits in at a different point. Yeah. And of course, the Greek myths have more variation too. It's just that we're used to reading Hesiod, which just happens to be the canonical version that has survived so well. Yeah. Yes.
Well, do we have any other questions or comments?
Giambattista, I agree about. I agree about that. Actually, as I was reading that, I thought, no, that's probably not right. I should have checked it. Yeah, that's right. And that makes it less likely. But you never, I mean, I don't know. It's also possible, I suppose, with Metis and Mart, it's also possible that even if no one's saying that that's where the Greek word comes from, but it's possible that, right, but the idea is that this was already a concept, that she was a Titaness, the mother of Athene, and maybe the idea, and then people kind of made the connection, but I don't know, I'm not sure. Yeah. We can discount that one.
We have a question from Mark Pizzato. How does Seth's dismemberment and castration? Sorry, Mark, would you be able to give the question yourself? I'm afraid I'm not sure I understand what you've written.
Yes, well, I'm trying to remember because I teach theater history, and there are some important Ramesseum papyrus drama or potential performances along the banks of the Nile, which include the pharaoh playing Horus, and how that involves the myth of, his father Osiris being dismembered by Set, his uncle, but then also there's some element of castration in that. So I'm wondering how, I realize that's the later generation, but how you might see that as parallels to the Greek myths.
So tell me, I was just distracted there. Can you repeat the question? It was could you say it
sorry,
again?
I'm trying to remember the details myself, but it does involve the testes of, I think it's Horus being returned to him after his battle with Set, which parallels his getting vengeance for the dismemberment of Osiris by Set.
Yeah.
And I know this from the Ramesseum dramatic papyrus, which was probably performed along the banks of the Nile around 2000 BC.
Well, all these myths, I mean, it's a reflection of the same sort of thing, I suppose. I didn't really get into Horus and Seth in this paper, but it involves many sort of similar themes, again, deployed in different ways. I guess that's yes. Well, castration. How do you punish your enemies? I mean, castration is a relatively tame way of doing it, isn't it? Really, I think it's that must have gone all the time, so it's bound to end up in these myths. The problem is how to, I mean, I suppose one could end up saying that they're completely independent, but there may be a connection there. Not much of an answer. I think it's part of the same. The Horus and Seth myth, the Osiris, Horus, and Seth myth, is related to this, but it's a little bit different because it's a sort of conflict that takes place in the same generation, and then involves, well, first the same generation and then the son. So it's not quite parallel to the sort of Hesiod version of it. It takes another generation. So I'm not answering that very well. It may be connected. I should do another paper. Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Well, in the old Orphic papyrus, Giambattista, okay. So rather circumcision than self-patrician. In the old Orphic tradition, doesn't wait a minute, doesn't there's incest going on, and there doesn't Zeus Zeus has sex with Demeter, isn't Demeter his I forget. I've forgotten actually. Who are the parents of Persephone? He has sex with Persephone and produces Dionysus, doesn't he? And who's Persephone's mother in that version? Is that his own mother? There's a dispute about that, isn't there, in the Devani papyrus? Do you remember? Yeah. I can't. Isn't there a line in the Devani papyrus which is interpreted as Zeus having intercourse with his mother? Am I making this up?
I don't know.
It's interesting to think about which, in the case of Hesiod, it's interesting to think about which sorts of things are eliminated, are sort of are not present in that canonical version, because Zeus So this certain types of incest don't happen in Hesiod. I think Egyptian myths, generally speaking, are certainly more colourful and expansive. Yes, that's probably what I'm thinking. Yes, yes, yes. So Egyptian myths are more allow for much more kind of variation and stranger things happen too. Like the one that comes to mind is Horus beheading Isis. But that's another thing. That has to do with the way gods are imagined. I think the notion of a deity, things like dying and gods dying, the size of gods, the sorts of things they do, the sorts of things they do to each other, slightly different in Egypt, I think. Enough? Well,
yeah. So, are there is there anything else that anyone wants to say, or shall we call an end to Ian's questions? Well, thank you very much, Ian, for this. It was really, really great, and
very much.
And we're all thrilled to hear it. So yes, thank you all for coming, and we're going to be back in a month's time to hear Marina Ascolano Poveda talk about Egyptian astronomy and Greek astronomy. So I look forward to seeing many of you or all of you there. But yes, so thank you and goodbye.
Thanks very much.